Ruben Amorim is one of, if not the most successful Sporting manager of all time. Under his leadership, Sporting broke title droughts and dominated Portuguese football. But it has not always been smooth sailing. The club was in turmoil before he arrived, suffering from instability, poor management, and struggling to keep pace with Benfica and Porto. But in order to look at the good times, first we have to go back. So first we have to go all the way back to the 2014-15 season. The current head coach Marco Silva comes in third in a rebuilding season at Sporting, but wins the Taça de Portugal, which is the Portuguese equivalent to the FA Cup. Ruben Amorim is at Benfica and they have just won another league title, which would be Amorim's last season as a Benfica player, winning Benfica's 34th league title. But before we get into anything else, let me introduce you to this man right here. Bruno de Carvalho was in charge of saving and rebuilding the club as the club's president at the time. He is known as the Portuguese version of Donald Trump. He's very outspoken, he's very stubborn in his ways, and what he wanted was for Sporting to be competing on the biggest stage of them all. But even though Marco Silva had success at Sporting, it wasn't good enough for Bruno de Carvalho, as at the end of the season, Marco Silva was sacked as Sporting manager. Now, the official reason was because he wasn't wearing the correct attire, which is linked to be a tie that he was supposed to wear as a manager. But the real reason of Marco Silva's sacking was to make one of the biggest gambles of all time. Because in came in the Benfica manager of that last season and Ruben Amorim's manager at the time, Jorge Jesus. At this point, Jorge Jesus was already establishing himself to be one of the best managers in Portugal, if not in Europe, taking Benfica to Europa League finals and also winning 3 league titles with them, including the last 2 in a row, 13-14 and 14-15. This sent shockwaves through Portuguese football, as it was unprecedented and no one thought it would ever happen. In the presentation, Jorge Jesus said that his dad was actually a Sporting fan, and before he died, he wanted Jorge Jesus to manage Sporting. So that was his reason of actually going to Sporting. But the actual reason is that he fell out with Luis Felipe Vieira, who was the president of Benfica at the time. It also should be noted at this time, the head physio is someone called Frederico Varandas. Keep that name in mind because you'll hear it again. And finally, to end the 2014-15 season, Ruben Amorim left Benfica to join Al Wakra SC in the Dubai Stars League. And soon after, he would retire. So, to give a quick recap going into the 15-16 season, Benfica lose one of their best managers in a while to their arch rival Sporting. Sporting take a massive gamble paying Jorge Jesus 5 million clean per year to try and get Sporting back to the big time. And the results were crazy. Bruno de Carvalho helped Jorge Jesus as much as he could, bringing in signings like Teo Gutierrez, Naldo, Everton and Brian Ruiz for a combined total of 10 million euros, and bringing in free transfers such as Alberto Aquilani, Hernan Barcos and Bruno Cesar, as well as a free transfer in JoãoPereira, another name you might hear of in a bit. But also, 2 names you want to keep note of is Sebastian Coates, who came in on loan in January of that season, and Brian Ruiz, who was bought in from Fulham for £1.3 million. However, in order to spend the money, Sporting had to make some sales, sacrificing guys like Cedric to Southampton for 7 million euros. Fan favourite Freddie Montero went to China for 5 million euros. And other guys like Naby Sarr and Mauricio left the club as well. And this is what Sporting's team looked like in a crucial game against Benfica in 2016. Why am I picking this game, you ask? This is the game the Sporting's title hopes went down the drain. Sporting were in first for the majority of the season, but not far behind them were Benfica, with players coming through like Nelson Semedo and Renato Sanchez on their end. They were dominating just as much as Sporting were. And with all the momentum in the world, Sporting were at home to Benfica. All they needed to do was win and at worst case scenario, get a draw. Unfortunately for Sporting, this Brian Ruiz miss put Sporting out of the title race, losing 1-0 to Benfica. Unfortunately, Bruno de Carvalho's gamble of Jorge Jesus did not pay off that season. Despite getting an impressive 86 points and only losing 2 games in the league all season, Sporting finished second with 86 points, whereas Benfica, more impressively, got 88, drawing 1 game and losing 4. Despite the season not going to plan, Bruno de Carvalho and Jorge Jesus ran it back again. This time, Bruno de Carvalho helped Jorge Jesus even more in the transfer market, bringing the likes of Bastos for a club record fee of 11 million euros, bringing guys like Alan Ruiz for 4 million euros, and making the permanent signing of Sebastian Coates for 4.7 million euros as well. In addition to bringing in some loan signings of Lazar Markovic, who is a player who thrived under Jorge Jesus, and Joel Campbell from Arsenal, 2 years removed from his great World Cup in 2014. Should also be noted, Chico Giraldes, João Palhinha and Daniel Podence were promoted from the B team due to good performances. However, this is where Sporting would become more of a sustainable club, selling players for big fees. Jean Mario departed for Inter Milan for 44.7 million euros. Islam Slimani joined Leicester for 31 million euros, as well as some other sales in there like Naldo and Elias. Sporting managed to make 87 million euros from that transfer window just on player sales. You might be wondering, why is Andre Carrillo there? He was sold for free, so he doesn't really make Sporting any money. So in the picture you can see he's obviously sold to Benfica, and there's a whole story behind this, but for the long and short of it, Sporting rejected multiple Premier League moves for Andre Carrillo because they didn't just match the fee that Bruno de Carvalho wanted. And Andre Carrillo and his agent weren't very happy about that, so they refused to sign a new contract at Sporting. And in return, Bruno de Carvalho dropped him from the team, didn't even let him train with the B team, had to train on his own for the whole of the 15-16 season. And who knows what would have happened if Andre Carrillo actually played in that 1-0 loss against Benfica. Because actually in the Supertaça, Andre Carrillo was the one who actually scored the first goal, beating Benfica. Who knows how the season would have gone if we had Carrillo playing. But as sort of revenge for what Bruno de Carvalho did to him, Andre Carrillo decided to join Benfica on a free transfer. And this would be the main team that Sporting would use throughout that 16-17 season. And unfortunately, the season was even worse than last year's. They finished 12 points behind Benfica in 3rd place, with Porto finishing in 2nd as well. The quarterfinals of the Taça de Portugal, 3rd round of Taça de Liga, and were in the group stage in the Champions League where they were eliminated. However, it wasn't all doom and gloom in the Champions League. They went to the Bernabeu and nearly beat Real Madrid. Unfortunately, 2 goals in the last 7 minutes from Morata and Ronaldo ensured Real Madrid's victory. They did manage to get 3 points off Legia Warsaw, but in the last game of that Champions League group stage, they had to face Legia Warsaw again. All they needed to do was draw and they'd be through, and unfortunately, they lost 1-0. It was, however, a very fruitful season for Bastos, scoring 36 goals in all competitions. But it wasn't enough to drag Sporting to the promised land of winning titles and performing in Europe. And some serious questions were begun to be asked about Jorge Jesus. Now, ladies and gentlemen, strap yourselves in, because the 2017-18 is probably one of the most craziest and darkest seasons in Sporting history, if not Liga Portugal history. It was a roller coaster of a season, but before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a look at the transfers in and out for that season. Bruno de Carvalho gave Jorge Jesus one more shot, emptying his wallet to bring in the best of the best. Jorge Jesus knew it would be his last season if he couldn't get some results in the league. Either a league title or at minimum a guaranteed Champions League spot, and maybe some other titles and a good showing in Europe. But in my opinion, this transfer window was probably one of the best that Bruno de Carvalho and Jorge Jesus ever had. Bruno Fernandes came in from Sampdoria for 9.7 million euros. Marcos Acuna came in for 9.5 million euros. An exciting centre midfielder, 20 years of age, Wendell, came in for Fluminense from Brazil for 7.5 million euros. That was bolstered with other signings as well, like Rodrigo Battaglia, Fabio Comintrao, another player who did very well under Jorge Jesus at Benfica, as well as free signings like Jeremy Mathieu, and the return of a fan favourite in Freddy Montero. And also, it should be noted, a youngster by the name of Rafael Leao was promoted to the first team as well. Sporting spent a total of 47 million euros that season. And in the departures, there was a few notable players that left as well. Adrien Silva joined Leicester in a deadline day fiasco for 20 million euros. Ruben Semedo joined Villarreal for 14 million euros. Paulo Oliveira joined Eibar for 4 million euros. And guys like Charlotto, Zegler, Teo Gutierrez and Everton also left the club. Sporting made a total of 49 million euros from that window. Now, this current Sporting squad was probably the strongest that Jorge Jesus and Bruno Carvalho ever had. Now, of course, you had regular Portuguese internationals like Rui Patricio, William Carvalho, but you also had them surrounded by new signings like Bruno Fernandes, Marcos Acuna, and signings from previous like Sebastian Coates as well. Not to mention incredible youth talent coming up. I mentioned Rafael Leao, but also you've got Daniel Podence, Gelson Martins, Wendell, João Pereira, as well as retaining last season's top scorer despite interest from big clubs in Bastos. This was the team that Sporting would use for the majority of the 17-18 season. So instead of going to right at the end of the season, let me take you to the 27th of January 2018, where Jorge Jesus won the Taça da Liga, or the Allianz Cup, beating Vitória Setúbal on penalties. It would be Jorge Jesus' first major trophy under Sporting if we're not counting the Super Taça for the 2015-16 season. And also, in terms of Champions League, unfortunately at this time, Sporting had finished in third place. They were given a very hard group with Barcelona, Juventus and Olympiacos. But this time they managed to get third place, playing 6 games, winning 2, drawing 1 and losing 3. Getting to third place, which meant they go into the Europa League. Up to that point, on the 21st match day against Estoril, Sporting had already dropped points in 6 games, meaning the title was pretty much out of reach by February. So here is where the story gets interesting. Let me take you to the 5th of April 2018. Sporting have beaten Astana and Victoria Pleasant to advance into the quarterfinals of the Europa League against a tough team in Atletico Madrid. And unfortunately, the first leg in the Politano goes 2-0 to Atletico Madrid. And you might think, 2-0 to Atletico Madrid, one of the best teams in Europe, there's no shame losing there. But Bruno Carvalho didn't see it that way. And the nickname, the Donald Trump of football, really did show at this point. He went to Facebook, which was his social media platform of choice at the time. Let me translate some of what Bruno Carvalho said from that Facebook post. We played against 11 opponents and 9 players for us who were on the field of play. There were players who lacked commitment, lacked focus, and who did not understand that the game lasts 90 minutes. These individual mistakes were excessive. The approach to the game was not serious enough, and what remains is a heavy loss that does not reflect what Sporting should represent. Bruno Carvalho singled out centre-backs Sebastian Coates and Jeremy Mathieu, as well as Portugal internationals Fabio Comintrao and Gelson Martins, as well as star striker Bastos for their lack of commitment. Some say Bruno Carvalho's biggest undoing at his time in Sporting was the refusal to sort of bite his tongue and just let things happen. The aftermath of Bruno Carvalho's criticism of the players on Facebook after the 2018 loss for Atletico Madrid was dramatic and had lasting consequences for the club. In response to Carvalho's public rebuke, 19 players from Sporting, including stars like Rui Patricio, William Carvalho and Bruno Fernandes, issued a joint statement on social media. They criticised Bruno Carvalho for his comments, stating that the public shaming was counterproductive and harmful to the team's unity. They'd emphasised their commitment to the club, but made it clear they did not agree with Bruno Carvalho's methods. How did Bruno Carvalho react, you think? He suspended 19 of the players involved, escalating this tension. However, the move faced backlash from fans and the media, with many criticising Bruno Carvalho of destabilising the club during a critical point in the season. Bruno Carvalho denied suspending any of the players, and the next week against Paços de Ferreira, the team played full, and they ended up winning the game as well. Winning 2-0 with goals from Bastos and Alan Ruiz. And the players showed that they were still a team and united, as well with coach Jorge Jesus, all celebrating together, sending a message to Bruno Carvalho. So after that, it was all quiet. There was obviously still some tension in the squad, but the players continued winning the next 3 games after that. There was only 2 games left of the league season, and Sporting were currently in second, where they had to go play Benfica at home. Benfica were level on points with Sporting at the time. If Sporting won here, then they would get second place, which in the new format of the Champions League and getting places for it, only first and second got into the Champions League, third got straight Europa League qualifying. So the money pool was between like 40 million euros difference of getting into the Champions League than the Europa League. So Sporting really needed that. But unfortunately, they drew 0-0 to Benfica at home, meaning that Benfica was still level on points with Sporting. But the good thing was that because Benfica drew to them earlier in the season as well, it would be decided by goals against. And because Sporting scored 1 goal against Benfica. That means if it went to a tie, Sporting would qualify for the Champions League in second place. So, what do you think happened on the last game against Maritimo? Last game of the season, away in Madeira. Sporting unfortunately lost 2-1. With 2 bad mistakes from veteran goalkeeper Rui Patricio, it sent Sporting into third place as Benfica won their game as well. And the final table read Porto with champions with 88 points, Benfica in second with 81 points, and Sporting in third with 78 points. This added further tension to the squad, the fans, and the president. In May 2018, a day after that game, tensions boiled over while a group of club supporters spoke to players like Marcos Acuna and Jorge Jesus in the airport, criticising them for lack of commitment to the club and the badge. They had to be separated by security, but, at that time, everyone thought, just a one-off. However, 2 days later, tensions boiled over when a group of masked supporters stormed the club's training ground in Alcochete. The attackers physically assaulted players and staff, leading to widespread condemnation. Bastos was hit in the head with a belt multiple times, whereas others were battered and bruised as well. While Bruno Carvalho denied any involvement, his leadership was heavily scrutinised, as the toxic environment under his tenure was seen as a contributing factor. However, one thing I haven't mentioned is that there actually was 1 game left in the season after that attack, and that was the final of the Taça de Portugal, which is the equivalent of the FA Cup in Portugal. They played against newly promoted team Desportivo das Aves. Now, Aves had finished 13th in the league at that point, so it was seen as sort of an easy win for Sporting, if not for those Alcochete attacks. But of course, the players were demoralised, some of them suffering from, sort of PTSD from that attack. None of them were really ready to play this game, as it was only 7 days after the attacks. And Sporting ended up losing 2-1 to Aves, which was a historic moment for Aves, but also a historical new low for Sporting. So, to recap the 2017-18 season, finished 3rd in the Portuguese league the 2nd year in a row, were winners of the Taça de Liga, which was seen as a positive at the time. They also were runners-up of the Taça de Portugal and were knocked out in the group stage in 3rd place in the Champions League and managed to get to the quarterfinals of the Europa League in that same season as well. However, this was the beginning of the end for Sporting. And honestly, that story about the attack on the academy, that's only sort of the beginning of the story. If you want me to make a video describing everything that happened and lead up to it, there's so much more you can get into. But if you want to see a video like that, let me know. But back to the actual timeline, it should be noted at this point, Ruben Amorim has completed a sort of internship with Man United and Jose Mourinho, and he is just about to get his first manager job in the next season. But not to get ahead of ourselves. After the shocking attack on Sporting's training ground in May 2018, several key players decided to rescind their contracts at the end of the season, citing unsafe working conditions and a hostile environment created by the club's leadership. The list of players who terminated their contracts were Rui Patricio and William Carvalho, captain and vice-captain of Sporting, arguably the 2 biggest losses in that Sporting team. Both had been at Sporting since they were teenagers, sort of 14, 13 years of age as well, and both decided to leave on a free transfer at the time. José Martins was an up-and-coming winger who had a very good season last season and the season before, having great performances against Real Madrid and Barcelona. Bruno Fernandes did actually rescind his contract, but then re-signed later on, as did Bastos, who was brought back to the club. Rodrigo Battaglia also rescinded his contract, but was brought back in the same reason as Bruno Fernandes and Bastos. And lastly, the last 2 players to rescind their contract were Daniel Podence and Ruben Ribeiro. The exodus of talent deeply impacted Sporting, both financially and competitively. Due to market values at the time, it's said that Sporting lost over 70 million euros worth of players that season. And there is one other name I haven't included in that list, and that is Rafael Leao. We talked about him a bit earlier, just that he was promoted to the first team that season and had a very good start, scoring against FC Porto on his debut. Now, the reason he's separate from the list is because everyone in that list that you've just seen either settled their debts with the club or the club they went to settled their debts with Sporting. However, Rafael Leao is a strange case. Rafael Leao was actually found guilty of lying to the courts. He wasn't even in the training ground or at the training ground at the time of the attacks. And in his testimony to police and to the courts, he said that he was there and he felt for his life. Therefore, the courts found him guilty and also found Lille guilty of breaching his contract. This meant that Rafael Leão actually owed Sporting 16.5 million euros. Sporting had originally sought out 45 million euros, citing the release clause in his contract, but the court decided on that lower amount. While Leão has appealed the decision multiple times, the obligation still stands. There have been rumours of clubs helping to pay that debt like AC Milan and Lille, but as of yet, the debt hasn't been paid. So it's a new season. The 18-19 season is upon us, and managerial changes are upon us as well. Jorge Jesus has been sacked by Bruno de Carvalho, reasoning being 90 million euros was spent trying to win the league, and Jorge Jesus failed on 3 attempts, only winning 1 singular Taça de Liga as well. He was replaced by the late Sinja Mihajlovic. However, don't say hello to Mihajlovic too long, because 9 days later, he was sacked as well. Why was he sacked, you ask? Well, remember Bruno de Carvalho, the person who posted on Facebook, some see as responsible for the attacks on the academies? He was given a vote of no confidence, and he was expelled as president of Sporting and as a member of Sporting Clube de Portugal. This meant there was a new interim president while elections were going on. So everybody meet the new president, Sousa Sintra. And Sousa Sintra actually is the one who sacked Sinja Mihajlovic and brought in his own manager, José Peseiro. It should be noted this decision to sack Mihajlovic actually cost Sporting 3 million euros later down the line due to unlawful termination. But with the club in disarray without an actual president, Sousa Sintra has to take the reins. And his first 2 signs of actions were big ones. Re-signing Bruno Fernandes and Rodrigo Battaglia to the same contracts, and offering Bastos an eye-watering 100,000 euros per week to re-sign with the club. And interim president Sousa Sintra was not afraid to splash the cash. Rafinha was brought in a previous signing by Bruno de Carvalho last January, but only made the move official in the summer. He was brought in for Victoria Guimarães for 6.5 million. Other players like Abdullah Diaby came in for 4.5 million. Bruno Gaspar, Idrissa Doumbia, Christian Borja all came in the club as well. Emmanuel Viviano was someone brought in by Bruno de Carvalho but never actually played a single game for the club, as the new administration didn't feel confident behind the goalkeeper, and he was released a few seasons later without even playing a game. Renan Ribeiro was also brought in, a goalkeeper which Sousa Sintra actually said he has the work ethic of Cristiano Ronaldo, which doesn't really make much sense as a goalkeeper, but you know what, Sousa Sintra, you do you. And finally, in the incomings, the main one was the return of a club hero. In a time of turmoil, Luis Nani came back to the club he loved and tried to save them. A mixture of youth talent was promoted as well to the first team. Jovan Cabral made his debut that same season, as did Miguel Luis. On the way out, though, we mentioned the players that had left before, but with the fees finally settled, we can include them in the full list as well. But I won't make them the marquee signings in the graphic, as you'll see, because we've already been through them. But Cristiano Piccini left the club for 8 million euros. Demiral, who was an up-and-coming centre-back, left for Alanyaspor for 3.5 million euros. Mateus Pereira went on loan, even though we could have done with someone of his talent at the time. And fan favourites like Bruno Cesar, Freddy Montero and Brian Ruiz were let go on free transfers. The worst loan in history. Sporting loaned João Palhinha to Sporting Braga. Why is this a bad loan, you ask? Because as a part of that deal, if Sporting were to sell João Palhinha, they'd actually owe Sporting Braga 15% of the next transfer sale, which really makes absolutely no sense at all. Once all the fees were paid for the players who left the club and rescinded their contracts, Sporting made a total of 101 million from that transfer sales. But you think if they had the upper hand in negotiations and the leverage, you think that could have possibly doubled with some player sales, including youngsters like Gelson Martins and Rafael Leão. Just after the season started in September, do you remember Frederico Varandas, the club doctor and main physio of the club? He became Sporting president after elections, winning the elections despite some heavy competition. So, in the last sort of month or so, Sporting have had 2 new managers and 2 new presidents as well. And Frederico Varandas' job is to keep the club afloat. Now, back to Ruben Amorim. Amorim started his first ever managerial job this season as well. He started working as a manager in 1890 season with 3rd division team Casa Pia. He actually lost his first 2 games in charge, and with doubt setting in, he announced if he lost the 3rd game, he would quit. In the next match, he changed the system to a 3-back. With the new system working, Casapia went on an amazing unbeaten run. He also felt he had found the formation that allowed him to produce the football he wanted. However, in January 2019, the team was deducted 6 points and he was suspended from all footballing activities for 1 year after giving instructions during a football match without having the required authorization and coaching level to do so. Even though the bans were lifted after, he still presented his resignation to Casapia in the aftermath. And speaking of Ruben Amorim, his future director of football, Hugo Viana, was appointed sporting director at Sporting just a few days after Varandas took the presidency. And to say Hugo Viana didn't present himself the best way to Sporting fans right off the bat. He released club legend and icon Nani to join Orlando due to the fact that he was a high earner at the time and at the age of 32 had no resale value. They also felt freeing up the wage could help them more in the summer and January to rebuild. If that wasn't bad enough, his next order of business might have been even worse. Thiago Ilori was bought in from Reading for €2.4 million. Why is this such a bad transfer, you ask? Well, one, he was made one of the highest paid players at Sporting at the time, but he was also not liked by Sporting fans anyway. Ilori was a product of Sporting's youth academy, but his departure in Liverpool to 2013 was quite controversial. Thiago Ilori left under President Bruno Carvalho in 2013, and he sort of forced a move away from Sporting. He was unwilling to renew his contract under terms that Sporting and Bruno de Carvalho considered reasonable. Instead, he pushed to a move to abroad to Liverpool. Thiago Ilori was heavily booed during the team announcements on his sort of re-debut in Sporting's game against Benfica, symbolising that the fans weren't behind the move and thought it was a waste of resources when we had players in the academy who could do the same job. At the time, you had guys like Domingos Duarte, who was considered an up-and-coming youngster, but was constantly loaned out. Many felt he would be better than Thiago Ilori. Same with Ivanildo Fernandez. And of course, I mentioned Demiral being sold. Many fans think the $3 million that was given to Sporting only to sign Thiago Ilori for $2 million was a waste of resources. One of the other big decisions Hugo Viana and Frederico Varandas had to make was sacking Jose Peseiro due to the club's poor league form. The replacement was an unknown guy by the name of Marcel Kaiser, and thus Kaiser Ball was born. So this is the team that Marcel Kaiser had to work with. A new goalkeeper replacing Rui Patricio in Renan Ribeiro, 2 new fullbacks in Borja and Ristovski, midfielder partnership of Battaglia Gudelj, Rafinha and Cunha on the wings, Bruno Fernandes and Bastos, and the ever-reliable centre-back pairing of Coates and Jeremy Mathieu. Marcel Kaiser actually took the team to a 4-game unbeaten run in the league and impressed many with his attacking style of play, scoring 5 against Nacional, 4 against Deportivo Aves, and 3 against Rio Ave. And Marcel Kaiser did something that no one thought was possible. In his first season with the team he had, Sporting managed to win the double, the Taça de Portugal and the Taça de Liga. Despite finishing 3rd in the league, there were some positive signs in the squad. Bruno Fernandes was the top goalscorer in all competitions from midfield with 32 goals. And the team had some decent results under Marcel Kaiser in the league, including beating Belenenses 8-1 and beating Porto on penalties on 2 different occasions, thanks to the heroics of goalkeeper Renan Ribeiro. Sporting also had a decent Europa League campaign as well, only losing 1 game in the group stage to Arsenal, but then went to the Emirates to draw 0-0. Kaiser Ball continued to excite the fans, including a 6-1 win over Karabag. However, they went out in the round of 32 versus Villarreal. However, in the league, Sporting still finished 13 points behind champions Benfica and 11 points behind second place in FC Porto. After a successful season, including 2 domestic cups, fans felt Marcel Kaiser had something to build with. But unlike the rest of this video, first I'm going to show the departures, and then I'll include what came in. Sporting were hit heavy in the transfer window, with Hugo Viana and Frederico Varandas needing to make money to keep the club afloat. Star winger Rafinha was sold to Stade Rennes for €21 million. Up-and-coming right-back Thierry Correa was sold for €12 million. Star striker Bastos was sold for €7 million due to his high wage affecting the squad. Other players left the club as well, like Domingos Duarte, Jonathan Silva, as well as some other rotation players in Yuri Medeiros and Carlos Mané. Also, a big loan move was Matheus Pereira to West Brom. Again, much like last season, it felt like a strange move. Especially with Rafinha going, Matheus Pereira could have operated on that wing and been an ideal replacement. Also, it should be noted, 23-year-old Ryan Gould was released by Sporting to Ferenc as well. And the players who came in the year before, Diaby and Gaspar, were loaned out to Besiktas and Olympiacos respectively. So why did you do the departures first? Well, let me tell you what they replaced them with. First of all, Luciano Vieto came in from Atletico Madrid as part of the Gelson Martins compensation, but the fee actually reads as 11 million euros. Valentin Rostier was an up-and-coming right-back just coming off an ACL tear, was signed from Ligue 1 for 5 million. Rafael Camacho, despite having less than 10 games professional experience, was signed from Liverpool under-21s team for 5 million. Eduardo Henrique was brought from the Brazilian League after spending last season on loan at Belenenses for 3 million euros. And probably the worst three signings of them all, Jesse Rodriguez was brought in on loan from Paris Saint-Germain to play at striker with a loan fee of 2 million euros to replace Bas Dost and eventually Luis Felipe, who tore his ACL later that season. Another loan player brought in was Yannick Balassi, someone also coming with an ACL tear and a poor move to Everton. And lastly, Fernando came in from Shakhtar Donetsk, who was a up-and-coming winger but didn't even play a single game for the club. Honestly, the best signing here is Luis Neto on a free transfer. Someone with experience and a centre-back that Sporting needed because Thiago Ilori wasn't up to scratch. Be noted, Pedro Mendes was promoted from the under-23s as well, as was Gonzalo Plata, an up-and-coming Ecuadorian winger who was brought in from Independiente for 4 million euros that last season. So this is the team that Marcel Kaiser would have had going into the season. And you might think, why do you say would have had? Well, because one day after the transfer window ended, Federico Varandas and Hugo Viana decided to sack Marcel Kaiser. This was a strange decision at the time. Like I mentioned, 2 domestic cups last year, and it seemed like he was building a good foundation. However, a 5-0 loss to Benfica in the Supertaça really did not help Marcel Kaiser. Nor did the 1-1 draw to Marítimo on the first game of the season and a 3-2 loss to Rio Ave the day before deadline day. Marcel Kaiser was replaced by former Wolverhampton centre-back and previous manager of Belenenses Sad Silas. And it was his job to try and steer the team forward. Silas was actually done pretty well at former club Belenenses. In December 2018, he was named Manager of the Month and achieved positions of 12th and 9th in his first 2 seasons with Belenenses. However, when Belenenses became Belenenses Sad, he was sacked on the 4th of September when the team hadn't scored in the first 4 games of their campaign. So, from being sacked from Belenenses Sad to falling upwards to being the new Sporting manager. And to say Silas didn't have a great vote of confidence from President Federico Varandas is an understatement. In his presentation, Varandas actually said that he was his 3rd choice manager and said that he tried to hire Jose Mourinho, but he, quote, didn't want to go to a club full of crazy people. His 2nd choice was Leonardo Jardim, who also rejected the move. At the exact same time Silas was appointed, Ruben Amorim was appointed Braga's B-team coach. They were in the 3rd tier of Portuguese football at the time and won 7 of his first 8 games. But now back to Silas for a second. He was not helped at all by the sale of Bruno Fernandes to Manchester United for 65 million euros. Sporting's best player gone in January. And even with the highly rated striker Andres Sporra coming in, it still wasn't enough for Silas. However, unfortunately, Silas had an uphill battle. And from November, in the next 13 games, Sporting lost 6 of them, including a 1-0 loss to Tondela, a 3-1 loss to Gil Vicente, a 2-1 loss to Porto, a 2-0 loss to Benfica, and a 1-0 loss to Braga, ending it off with a 3-1 loss to Famalicão, as well as the draw with Rio Ave in there as well. However, at this point, it wasn't just Sporting who was struggling. Sporting Braga head coach Sapinto was sacked and was replaced by, you guessed it, Ruben Amorim from the B team. In his first game in charge on the 4th of January, he led them to a 7-1 away demolition against Belenenses Sad. And 3 weeks later, won the first trophy of his career, winning the Taça da Liga against Porto with a last-minute goal from Ricardo Horta, which would be Braga's first trophy in 4 years. Amorim kept breaking records at Braga. Amorim recorded Braga's first win away to Benfica in 65 years, with JoãoPereira scoring the game's only goal. Up to that point, he only lost 1 point in the league, after Braga drew 2-2 at home to Gil Vicente. During his time with Braga, he picked up 10 wins in 13 games, with Braga being placed in third at that time. He only lost 2 games for the club in the round of 16 in the 2019-20 UEFA Europa League against Rangers. 3-2 away in the first leg on the 20th of February and 1-0 in the return leg at home. Speaking of Europa League, Sporting in Europa League actually had a decent first game in the round of 32, beating Istanbul Başakşehir 3-1. But of course, it wasn't all going to plan. In the second leg, Sporting choked it and ended up losing 4-1 in the 190th minute of extra time. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's what you've all been waiting for now. On the 4th of March 2020, Jorge Jesus was sacked due to the team's poor results in the league and Europe. And the man who came in at a cost of 10 million euros, Ruben Amorim. Despite only having 2 months of top flight experience, Sporting paid 10 million euros for his services, the third highest transfer fee for a manager in history at that time. It was one last roll of the dice from Frederico Varandas and Hugo Viana. If this didn't go well, both of them would be out of jobs. Especially Federico Varandas, over the last 2 years, has appointed 3 different managers and also called Sporting fans idiots in that same season. But this is where the rebuild happens. However, the appointment of Ruben Amorim, as to be expected, was not taken well by most Sporting fans. Not only was he an unexperienced coach, he was a former captain of their arch-rivals Benfica. But famously, at the press conference, Ruben Amorim said the following: "All I hear is people asking, what if it goes wrong? But I ask, what if it goes well?" And that philosophy was maintained throughout his time at Sporting. For his first game for Sporting against Aves, Sporting went to a 3 at the back, something unprecedented for Sporting, as the last 4 or 5 managers had 4 backs. Thiago Ilori, Sebastian Coates and Jeremy Mathieu started as a 3-back that game, with Ristovski and Acuna playing as the wing-backs. A good midfield pairing of Battaglia and Wendell, Gonzalo Plata and Vieto on the wings, and finally goalscorer Andres Pereira up top. Sporting won 2-0 in his first game. However, something drastic was about to happen that was out of anyone's control. The COVID-19 pandemic hit. Football was suspended for 4 months. In the midst of all the chaos, Ruben Amorim had some time to implement some new strategies into the team. And this started instantly in a 2-2 draw versus Vitória Guimarães. Sporting again were a 3-back, but with a noticeable change. Youngsters were being promoted from the B team to play. And I guess you could say, because the season was already done, Sporting were out of the league by that point in general, already in 4th, that Amorim could have experimented and it would have been fine. But the results actually paid off. Eduardo Quaresma was promoted to starting centre-back over Thiago Ilori, joining the 3-back of Jeremy Mathieu and Sebastian Coates. Mateus Nunes was put in the pivot next to Rodrigo Battaglia. And even though Sporting drew that match 2-2, thanks to a Marcus Edwards equaliser, there were still some signs of hope with the young talent. The full list of people that Ruben Amorim promoted from the B team to play in that last half of the season for the main team goes as followed: Eduardo Quaresma, 18 years of age; Nuno Mendes, 18 years of age; Mateus Nunes; Joelson Fernandes; and Thiago Tomas. And at this point, he already cancelled the loans of Jesse Rodriguez, Yannick Balassi, and Fernando, as he didn't see them as a part of his philosophy. Although there were some foundation pieces to work with, Sporting still finished 4th in the league. Only made the 3rd round of the Taça de Portugal, made the semi-finals of the Taça da Liga, and round 32 of the Europa League, as well as earlier losing the Super Cup 5-0 to Benfica. And what is crazy as well, the top scorer, despite leaving at the end of January, was Bruno Fernandes, with only 15 goals. After the COVID season, 2021 is now upon us. And still, there are no fans in stadiums. And Ruben Amorim is still an unproven manager at this point. But with some youth at his disposal, he goes into the transfer market, bringing in guys like Pedro Gonçalves from Famalicão, who at the time cost 8.5 million euros, Fadal came in with some vital experience at the centre-back position, especially in a back three after Jeremy Matthew's retirement the season before. Nuno Santos was brought in to play on the wings. Pedro Porro was brought in on loan from Manchester City. Antonio Adan was brought in to be the #1 goalkeeper. And veteran presence came in with JoãoPereira and Antunes, former Portuguese internationals. JoãoPereira coming back for a third time. Some more youth players were promoted from Sporting B. Gonzalo Inacio, a 19-year-old centre-back, was promoted, as was guys like Thomas Silva, Dario Usugo, Daniel Bragança, joining players from last season like Nuno Mendes, Thiago Tomas and Eduardo Quaresma. But someone who isn't a signing but returned to the club was JoãoPereira. He actually wanted to leave the club due to the way he'd been treated at Sporting before, but Ruben Amorim convinced him to stay and signed him to a new contract, making him the starting holding midfielder in Amorim's system. In terms of on the way out, Ruben Amorim had it clear out. Wendell joined Zenit for 20 million euros. Marcos Acuna joined Sevilla for 11.25 million euros. Matheus Pereira joined West Brom for 8.2 million euros. Vieto went to Al Hilal for 7 million euros. However, the culling of the squad did not stop there. Players who he couldn't sell due to their high wages and didn't see room for them in the team were loaned out. Diaby was loaned out to Getafe, Battaglia to Alaves, Doumbia to Huesca, Rafael Camacho to Rio Ave, Misic to Zagreb, Eduardo Enrique to Crotone, Thiago Ilori to Lorient, Bruno Gaspar to Vancouver, Mateus Oliveira to Cortiba, and this was the squad that Ruben Amorim had at his disposal until the January transfer window. Inacio, Coates and Fadal made the back three. Adan was a solid presence in goal. The fullbacks of Nuno Mendes and Pedro Porro were electrifying. Nuno Santos and Pedro Gonçalves were goal scorers on the wings. A midfield pivot of JoãoPereira and João Mario. And lastly, intermittently swapped was Andres Sporar and Thiago Tomas. However, the season didn't go off the plan. Although Sporting beat Paços de Ferreira 2-0 in the first game of the season, they had Europa League qualifying to maintain. Whilst they beat Aberdeen at 1-0 thanks to a goal from Thiago Tomas, advancing to the next round, the squad was seriously hit with injuries and the COVID-19 virus. They ended up losing to Lask 4-1 at home, meaning their journey in Europe was over for this season. But some saw that as a blessing in disguise. No fixed congestion, just one game a week for a relatively young squad. That could be the trick into something very good. January has begun and Sporting are unbeaten in the league. They've dropped a few points here and there, mainly to Famalicão and Porto, but all the rest have been wins. Some of them lucky in the last minute, thanks to heroics from Sebastian Coates, but also some resounding victories, like a 4-0 win over Vitória de Guimarães. It would be the first success for Sporting under Ruben Amorim in the Taça da Liga. First beating Mafra 2-0 at home, then coming from 1 goal down in the 85th minute to 2 goals thanks to Jovan Cabral, making it 2-1 and advancing Sporting into the final, where Ruben Amorim faced his old club, SC Braga. And on his first attempt, he won the Taça da Liga with Sporting. In his second final in the Taça da Liga, he won it, winning it last year with Braga and now beating Braga in the final to win it with Sporting. Now you might be wondering, why did you stop in January? Why did you say the team up until January was like this? Well, that's because Ruben Amorim was chasing a striker and was chasing the same striker that he worked with at Braga since the summer transfer window. However, the board could not get the funds together and the deal never happened. However, on January deadline day, Ruben Amorim's final piece of the puzzle was fit in the squad. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to one of my favourite players of all time for Sporting, Paulinho. Number 21 for Amorim, costing a club record fee of 16 million euros, plus Sporar going on loan the other way and Christian Borja going to Braga on a permanent deal, which is valued at 3 million euros. After that January transfer deadline day, Sporting went to Benfica, which would be Ruben Amorim's big test as a Benfica fan. He was unable to beat Benfica last time at Sporting. Was he able to do it this time? Yes, he was, thanks to a Mateus Nunes 90th minute winner to make it 1-0 to Sporting. And from there, they won 4 more games in a row, beating Maritimo 2-0, beating Gil Vicente 2-1, and Paços de Ferreira 2-0. At this point, it should be noted they also got knocked out of the Taça de Portugal to Maritimo as well. Another draw followed after a 2-0 win against Portimonense, where they played Porto away from home. They managed to beat Santa Clara, Tondela and Vitória Guimarães. But here is where the trouble started to happen. 2 draws in a row, one away to Moreirense and another one to Famalicão. And despite a poor showing, they managed to beat Farense 1-0 as well. But the drawing continued as they drew 2-2 to Belenenses SAD. This is the game that many fans believe that Sporting were going to win the league. Let me take you back to Braga. It's currently 0-0 at the 20th minute mark when Gonzalo Inácio picks up a second yellow card and gets sent off. For the rest of the game, Sporting play with 10 men. But from heroics from Pedro Porro and Mateus Nunes manages to score in the 81st minute, making it a 1-0 win to Sporting. All they had to do was win the next 3 games and they would be the champions. First up came Nacional, a 2-0 win for Sporting. Up next came Rio Ave, which was a 2-0 win for Sporting away. Here was the game that could win it all. Sporting versus Boa Vista at the Alvalade on the 11th of May 2021. What was the score, you ask, and what happened? Sporting won thanks to a Paulinho goal. That's right, the signing in January, the last piece of the puzzle, Paulinho scored the winning goal to get Sporting their first league title in 19 years. Ruben Amorim quickly silenced all doubters due to his philosophy, promoting young players and buying within the league, as well as buying young players with high potential. And no one was more happy than Frederico Varandas and Hugo Viana. Their gamble paid off and they delivered a title to Sporting. Although Sporting did end up winning the league unbeaten, unfortunately when the title was already won, they lost to their arch rivals Benfica 4-3. Meaning the season was not unbeaten. However, they won their final game against Marítimo 5-1 to only lose 1 game that season. In an incredible season, Sporting scored 65 goals and only conceded 20 in the league, finishing with 85 points. And the top scorer was not a striker, it was the winger, Pedro Gonçalves, brought in by Ruben Amorim from Famalicão. In Ruben Amorim's first season, he completed the double, Taça da Liga and the league title, again for the first time in 19 years. So that was a breakdown of the entire timeline it took from Ruben Amorim to become a coach, to being the Sporting coach, to winning the league with Sporting, and everything before that Sporting related. But let's just recap how he managed to rebuild Sporting from disaster to greatness. First up, promoting youth talent. And people may be able to say, you know, he had the talent already there at his disposal, he just got lucky. But under 2 different coaches in Kaiser and Silas, they had that at their disposal too, and decided never to use it. Dani Bragança was 21 years of age during the Kaiser season. Nuno Mendes, Inácio and Quaresma were still 17 years of age, but probably still could have made a difference considering what we had at the time. And he has continued to promote many youngsters throughout his time at Sporting, including the likes of Giovanni Kenda, Jenny Catamo, Yusuf Chimiti, Mateus Fernandes, as well as guys like Afonso Moreira, Rodrigo Ribeiro and Rafael Nel, just to name a few. Promoting players from the B team brought back an identity for Sporting. And a philosophy under Ruben Amorim is that no matter what age you are, whether you're 17 like Giovanni Kenda or ending your career like JoãoPereira and Luis Neto on the other side of 30, it doesn't matter how old you are, as long as you perform well in training and on the pitch, Ruben Amorim will put you in the team. And bringing back the identity of promoting players to the first team brings back a culture that is ingrained at Sporting in previous years. You look at guys like Ronaldo, Figo, Nani, João Moutinho, just to name a few examples, players that came through Sporting's youth academy. And making that the vocal point of a rebuild was very smart and paid off for Ruben Amorim. Number 2, his transfer policy. You can either look at it as buy low, sell high, or just making smart deals at the time. Out of the top 10 most expensive departures, Amorim has been responsible for 5 of them. Manuel Ugarte to PSG for 60 million, Mateus Nunes to Wolverhampton for 47.4 million, Pedro Porro to Tottenham for 40 million, Nuno Mendes to PSG for 38 million, and João Pereira to Fulham for 24.9 million euros as well. As well as other players who have been bought in and sold for profit. For example, like Tau, who was sold to Leicester for 16 million euros. A lot of his transfer philosophy was also buying players within the league. We mentioned Pedro Gonçalves and Nuno Santos, but even more recently, you've got guys like Marcus Edwards who have come in. Hidemasa Morita came in from Santa Clara, Ricardo Esgaio from Braga, Mateus Reis from Rio Ave, and even guys like Artur Gomes, Rochinha and Bruno Tabata. although the last three didn't have much of an impact on Sporting, they still were able to contribute when needed. In terms of just buying players and their market value doubling, according to Transfer Market, Victor Gyökeres is worth 70 million euros. He was bought by Sporting for 22 million euros. You could look at other examples, like Francisco Trincao, who according to Transfer Market is worth 23 million euros, despite only buying them for 10. Morten Hjulmand was bought for 20 million euros and now worth double that at 40 million euros. And guys like Zeno de Bast, Ousmane Diamonde and Conrad Harder, all under the age of 21, to grow and hopefully sell for big profit in the future. It's transfer dealings like these that have made Sporting such a sustainable club and should be for many years to come. Lastly, and number 3 was just Amorim being Amorim. I mentioned the first press conference he said, what if it goes well? And that's exactly how he presented himself at Sporting. He had a one for all for one policy as well, which basically meant you all were there for each other. And it shows when you watch Sporting play. They play as a team, as an organised unit, not a bunch of individuals. And that is something that Amorim instilled in those Sporting players, especially from a young age. You look at guys who he promoted into the first team who are currently still there. Gonzalo Inacio, Eduardo Quaresma, Daniel Bragança. All three of those guys have become leaders in their own right at Sporting. And the good thing about Amorim's philosophy is that anyone in that Sporting squad can be a captain. Because they're not a squad full of individuals. They're a squad full of leaders. So, that is the end of this video and the end of the timeline. Of course, we could go further and further on. We can go in the next 4 years. If that's something you want to see, let me know as a part 2 or a continuation of this. We can look at, the next 3 seasons he had, including that sort of awful one where we finished 4th, but of course winning the league the season after that. If you wanted to see something like that, please let me know. If you did enjoy this format, please let me know, because it was actually very fun to make. It did take a while to make, so I appreciate any feedback. Whether it's positive or negative, I'm really happy for any sort of feedback. If you want to leave criticism in the comments, cool. If you want to leave them in the comments, even better. But please like this video. As of recording, we're on like 1,150 subscribers. Can we make it to 200? 1,200. There we go. There's my maths being bad there. But yeah, that would be great. Thank you very much for watching. I've been Sam Fonseca. I'll see you next time. Peace.